Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. We're gonna just wait a minute or two to let you arrive. I don't know where you're sitting, but I'm sitting in my office in the most comfortable chair that I've ever sat in. I was telling Osheta as we were just chatting that sometimes like no surprise, I'm an intense person and I have a lot of passion. And sometimes I'm like at my desk leaning in on the screen, and sometimes I'm standing up. And for this conversation with my friend and sister Osheta, I'm like, I need to sit and settle and attune my soul to what's about to happen. So I hope you're as I do. And this is going to be a dynamic conversation. For those of you who are coming in, welcome. Welcome to Restoring Friendship Part 2, 2 of 5. And we've been waiting for you. We've been building this and imagining this and dreaming this conversation for quite some time. And so we're glad you're here. I see it happening. You would pop in your name and where you're participating from all over the country and the world. That'd be awesome. I know that Osheta loves to interact with what's going on in the comment thread. For us in our webinars here with Global Immersion, the comment thread is really a living document for us. This is a space where you can populate thoughts, ideas, quotes, learnings, resources that come to mind, or even that you hear mentioned in this conversation. Please feel free to post links and connect with one another in the comment section. It's always fun to see that happen. I also want to draw your attention to the Q&A feature. Again, this is a space, I want to reserve comment space for like reflections and ideas. Q&A space is where Osheta and I will be able to actually focus our energy and pay attention to that. We'll do our best to get to your questions, and as is true of all transformation, every kind of learning environment, new learnings beget new questions. And so we want to see the Q&A space populated. And so don't worry about asking the question right, just practice asking the question. We're going to do our best to get to some of it, and some of the questions that we're not going to be able to get to will serve as content for the live debrief session that will happen on Tuesday evening, May 18th from 6 to 7. And so this is for you who are live in this session. And I'm gonna put this in the chat thread right now. If you go to Global Immersion's link tree right now, you're going to see a registration for the live debrief. This is going to be exclusive for the who want to enter into this live debrief, and this is for you who want to connect a little bit to do the work of transforming your learning into living. And so again, Tuesday evening, May 18th from 6 to 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. For the first 25. We did it after part 1 with Jared McKenna, and we had folks country, and my notebook is stacked based on the learnings that emerged for me along the way. And so you see that right there. My name is Jared Swigart. For those of you who we haven't met, I'm the co-founding director of the Global Immersion Project, which is a peacemaking training organization focused on American Christians. We are cultivating everyday peacemakers to join God and others to make all things new. And so our conviction is that restoration is the mission of God, making peacemaking not an add-on to our faith, but the very essence of it. We use the word everyday peacemakers because from our point of view, peacemaking is not just for the professional humanitarians. Peacemaking is for all of us. And so we've created a 4-practice framework that kind of articulates what an everyday peacemaker is all about. The 4 practices are see, immerse, contend, and restore. We believe that everyday peacemakers are always learning to see more accurately, immerse more courageously, and contend more creatively. Let me nuance that a bit further. To see more accurately, everyday peacemakers recognize that our perspectives are not 20/20 vision, that we are never fully right and always partially wrong. We recognize that the healing of our sight is a relational, experiential, and even supernatural long pursuit. Immersing more courageously, everyday peacemakers intentionally displace ourselves off the roads of comfort and into reality with relational and transformational intent. That means that we're not trying to get close to folk in pain just to them and to leech and grab inspiration to feel more awakened. We actually pursue relationship in order to be transformed and then to partner together in the transformation of broken things. and then contend more creatively. We believe that justice, that the work of justice is not an individual endeavor, but it is a costly collaboration. And so, as we always say, we as everyday peacemakers have no idea how to contend until we first seen and immersed. And so, from our point of view, everyday peacemakers who see, immerse, contend actually join God and others in the work of restoration. Um, I think it's important, especially in setting up this particular conversation, to articulate our perspective on conflict and injustice. We think that conflict is inevitable, and we see injustice in all of its forms as seeking to diminish the image of God in others. We see conflict and injustice play out internally, that's inside of me, interpersonally, that's between us, and systemically, that's within the infrastructures that seek to organize us. And so while the work of peacemaking has to be focused on systems change, it also simultaneously has to focus on the hard, slow work of becoming more healthy individuals who are savvy at navigating hard conversations, tending to interrupted relationships, and bridging difference into new friendships. Or put another way, the road to systemic change only ever goes by way of internal and interpersonal peacemaking, which really brings us to this series, Restoring Friendship. Y'all, we find ourselves in a moment where relationships are disintegrating all around us. I mean, it is in the air, it is in the water, it is in probably in yours. I don't know a single person at the moment who's looking around going, yeah, every relationship in my life is on point. I don't think it's true for anybody. And so we're all noticing the fragility of relationships and that they're disintegrating, and that our skill at navigating the hard things with one another is actually degenerating a bit. And so that's why we've put together this series to learn from 5 global peacemakers who are going to really talk to us about how they center the work of interpersonal peacemaking, because it's critical to our life, love, and leadership as everyday peacemakers. And so a couple of weeks ago, we launched with Australian peacemaker Jared McKenna, who offered a remarkable pastoral invitation to allow the Spirit of Jesus to disarm us, to unshame us, and to relax us into the nothing more concerned with the restoration of all things than the spirit of the resurrected one. And we get to join into the flow, into the rhythm of the Spirit. Of course, today we get to hear from Osheta on May 27th. We hear from my brother in Oakland, Reverend Ben McBride, who was just featured on CNN's United Shades of America, talking about police reform and defunding the police. June the 10th, Robbie Damelin, who is an Israeli peacemaker, who is in literally the epicenter of some of the most intense violence on the planet at the moment. And then we'll close this series on July 1 with Irish poet and peacemaker Padraig Ó Tuama, who's going to talk to us about the power of language to disarm conflict. And so y'all register for these webinars. The registrations for all are available in our link tree, which I'll pop into the comment section again here. I encourage you to pre-register and get folk involved in this series. And then we also want to encourage you to deploy this series within your constituency to grow people's capacity to navigate the hard things with one another. Last thing before Osheta introductions, I personally enter into this conversation today with a very, very heavy heart, mindful of what's happening in Palestine and Israel at the moment. And many of you know that Global Immersion has been heavily invested within that conflict for the past decade, most specifically focusing on American Christians and altering our theology and behavior toward Israelis and Palestinians. And so we are intimately intertwined in what's happening real time in the streets in Israel, Palestine. And so my heart is broken, and I carry right now the memory of the Israelis and the Palestinians, souls that are beloved to God, who have died in the last week to that violence, have asked us, what is Global Immersion doing about this, and how can we respond? I'm letting you who are live know this is literally hot off the press. We haven't even gone public with this, but on Thursday, May 20th, we're going to be hosting a conversation with Evangelicals for the Middle East and the Evangelical Covenant Church. We're going to host a conversation on May 20th at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time between May Elise Cannon for Churches of Middle East Peace, Dominique Gilliard from the Evangelical Covenant Church, and Jack Munayer out of the Ecumenical in Palestine and Israel, to talk about the parallels between what is happening here with regard to Christian nationalism and over there with regard to Christian Zionism. And so the parallels between what are happening there and here are literally breathtaking. And we're going to explore that together. And then we're going to talk about the very tangible actions that we can take as American Christians to continue to seek a just peace in Israel and Palestine. And so the registration for that, you can find it in our link tree as well. I want to encourage you to pre-register for that experience as well. Okay, enough said. Osheta, welcome. Anytime I get to be on the phone or on the screen with you, I feel like my life gets better and I become a better version of myself. So thank you for carving out some time to be with us, to train peacemakers in the work of interpersonal peacemaking in this particular conversation. And so take it away. Introduce yourself and bring us into your life a little bit, your life, your work, your family, what it's like to navigate the pandemic in Minneapolis right now. And then we'll dive into the conversation.
Yeah. So hi, everyone. My name's Osheta Moore. I am a pastor in the Twin Cities area. I serve as a teaching pastor at Woodland Hills, which is a larger Anabaptist community, Jesus-centered church out here. And then I also partner with my husband as a pastor of this smaller church called Roots Covenant Church, that I serve as community life pastor there. So a lot of my ministry and a lot of my work is really rooted in that interpersonal relationship and internal peacemaking, seeking wholeness and living holistically internally and with others in order for us to truly be a part of dismantling broken systems that perpetuate oppression. So I'm more of a pastor than I am an activist, but I have had to really lean into a lot of that activism piece in this past year because we live in St. Paul, and George Floyd was murdered 10 minutes away from where we live. We have a lot of people who are passionate about anti-racism, and we had a lot of people who were asking questions, just beginning to understand it. And so I really had to enter into not a new expression, but a deeper expression of my peacemaking as it pertains to anti-racism, particularly for white people, just understanding like what this is, why does it matter, how is it in line with Jesus's picture of shalom, and what does it mean for us to live at peace with each other when we have these systems that have been codified by the lie of white supremacy? So that's really where I am right now in terms of like my leadership and what I'm passionate about. But a little bit about me, I'm a Southern girl at heart. I love Minnesota though. I never want to leave. This is my home. I love everything about Minnesota. But I'm from Texas, so I bring a lot of my Southern culture and Southern habits with me. So we do things like I make gumbo or red beans or rice every Monday because we lived in New Orleans for a while my husband was serving in a low-income community. Then we evacuated New Orleans when Katrina happened. He went to seminary in Boston. Then we moved to LA for a little bit. Then we moved here. So I've lived all around the country, and I've really had to lean into or understand more like, what does Jesus' peacemaking ethic look like in different contexts with different people in different seasons of my life? Because I really came into this passion for peacemaking. I know we're going to get more into this, Jer, because when I first started doing peacemaking work, it was really rooted in urban core development, really rooted in working with gang affiliated youth. Like we would have dinners with gang leaders from different gangs around our tables and ask them to leave their guns at home, like things like that. We were with our community when we lost students to gang violence. So like that was a huge part of me asking, how can we de-escalate this conflict? And what does the teachings of Jesus have to say about the reality of these kids' lives? They're surrounded by so much poverty, so much neglect, so much violence, so many stereotypes that they're expected to live into. What does honoring the image of God in them look like when everybody else says they're ended up for jail or death? Mm-hmm. But then when Katrina happened, we had to evacuate. And I was 8 months pregnant with our second. Our oldest was 3. And when we moved to Boston, my husband went to seminary and I stayed home and cared for kids. And then 3 months later, after we had our second, we found out we were pregnant with our third. So I had three little children.
Hmm.
And everything that I knew about peacemaking or shalom seeking, or the peacemaking ethic of Jesus, like I could not engage in because I was caring for these children. And so that's really where I started exploring, and this is why I love global immersion so much, exploring everyday peacemaking
Mhm.
and asking myself to rise to the challenge of being a peacemaker when all the things that I thought made a peacemaker, like the skill set or the education or the opportunity to do these sensational acts of dismantling violence or de-escalating conflict, when none of those are working in my life, my actual real life is what I'm presented with. Jesus is still my Prince of Peace. So
Mhm.
how do I show up as a peacemaker? And that's where I built my peacemaking ethic, in everyday, just relational ways. And that's where my first book, Shalom Sisters, came out of. And then we moved around and we moved here, and really found myself having a whole lot of conversations about race and justice and peacemaking, primarily because I can't believe that I can be at peace with you as a white person if I'm not at peace with myself as a Black woman. And in order for me to be at peace as a Black woman, then I have to be aware and have conversations about the ways our world is set up that keeps people that look like me continually oppressed and prevent us from thriving and living into God's dream for us as we should be, which is what I define shalom as, God's dream for us as we should be. And so, because just people say, like, how did you get into anti-racism work? And I'm like, I got into anti-racism work because I started to believe that God didn't make a mistake in making me Black, and that God had a unique call and invitation for me as a Black woman to own who I am, and to, from that place of confidence and love and peace within myself, then become a peacemaker. And that's just kind of the overflow to when I was like, I can't be at peace with myself. I can't be at peace with you if I'm not at peace with myself. So that's really like where I am. So like now I
Mhm.
live in St. Paul with my teenagers. I have an 18-year-old, a 15-year-old, and a 14-year-old. I have a dog who will probably bark because Mel's going to come anytime soon. And I pastor, and I just deeply love white people who are on this journey at any point, because it really matters that they're stepping up to this call of peacemaking.
I love that so much, Osheta. And I wonder, let's talk. I want to get into that in a minute, but even peacemaking as Christian people, I don't know what your experience has been in that regard, but my experience in like in articulating that I'm a Jesus centered, a Jesus oriented peacemaker, it's actually troubling to people. It's problematic. They're like, I don't understand the connection between the Christian faith and
Yeah.
peacemaking. So talk to us, like theologize with us a little bit around around the essence of your Jesus centered peacemaking. Live in a
Yeah.
milieu. We live in a milieu where it's like our faith has actually been weaponized to dominate. That's our
Yep.
reputation, right? Not
Yep.
not to bring peace. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, how much time do we have? Okay. So, one of my favorite theologians, Jonathan Martin, says if you want to have really good theology, you need to start at the garden. And so for me, when I think about my peacemaking, it's really rooted in the Hebraic concept of shalom. And when we look at the garden, we see that it was full of shalom. It was God's dream as for the world as it should be. There was health in the land. There was health. There was peace between humans and the animals. There was a sense of calling. There was intimacy with God. So when I think of my work as a peacemaker, I think of it first as what is an inherent, what is broken, what's not working the way it should in this instance, and then how can I partner with God in bringing the best, like getting it back to, I say the it is goodness of the garden. How can I be a partner with God to bring the it is good? So that's the kind of the first like
Mhm.
litmus test, if you will. I really believe that peace, and more specifically shalom, which is this picture of the world as it should be, as vibrant and whole, full of love, full of intimacy, exactly the way God wanted it. No shame, no conflict. That is part of my that's knitted into the way God wanted the world to be. And so if I'm going to partner with God, I'm going to try to get to that point. But then we look at the life of Jesus, right? And Jesus says, I have not come to abolish the law, but fulfill the law. And then he goes on to say that the law hangs on two commandments: love love God and love your neighbor. And then we watch as Jesus over and over again shows us how to take things that we believed were the ways we should interact with each other and push it to its furthest extent where we are fully loving our neighbor and we're fully loving God. And it's a challenge. And for me, peacemaking is that pushing it a little bit further, like actually saying, what if Jesus actually meant that? What did Jesus actually meant that blessed are the peacemakers? What did Jesus actually mean for us to love God and love our neighbor as we engage with each other? And so that for me, there's a certain list of things that I believe are inherent or important to my peacemaking. One is nonviolence. So I deeply believe that Jesus came to model for us a way of living with each other, of nonviolence and actually healing. And I look at Jesus on his way to the cross, being arrested in the garden, and having an opportunity to validate Peter's instinct to use violence to protect Jesus, which is, I mean, some would say like that's a good, I don't think many like Christians would say that's a good instinct. Like defend your faith, defend what's important to you. But Jesus says those who live by the sword die by the sword. And then Jesus kills that person who is actually coming to harm him. So that says something to me about a peacemaker, that part of this work is choosing to heal when I have an instinct to harm. The other thing that I look at the diversity of the disciples, not just like while Jesus was going through his ministry for those 3 years, but then after his resurrection, and then as they were building the church, and I look at how different they were. And that tells me that Jesus expects us to bring our full selves, even if we disagree with each other, into relationship with each other, because there's something about the kingdom of God. There's something about the Jesus way that will bind us together, that we can all rally under, and that we can have these conversations in love and civility with one another, believing that we're moving towards that end goal of shalom, where we are loving God and we're loving our neighbor and we're modeling a different way of being in this world. I refer to this often as like a third way. Many Anabaptist theologians refer to it as a third way. And then I also deeply believe that peacemaking is that part of my calling to be a peacemaker is not just I'm so at peace with you, Lord, you're so good, or I'm so at peace with myself, or I'm so at peace with my neighbor. But I really believe that peacemaking is a disruption and exposure of violence in systems. And I look at the whole of Jesus' ministry when he was offered kind of two options, like pay taxes or not, or condone or condemn the woman caught in the act of adultery. Like Jesus charted this other way that kind of held the spirit of the law and the intent, but like created this new way of being that exposed kind of all these loopholes in these systems that continually oppress people. And then I look at the cross where Jesus was dying. He was dying a death as a criminal, and he was exposing the violence of the Roman Empire by being humble and by submitting to it and sacrificially loving and not using retributive violence or anger. And then I also like deeply root my peacemaking in the Sermon on the Mount. So when somebody says that they're a follower of Jesus, and then but they kind of they're iffy on this idea of being a peacemaker, I really try to dig in and ask them like, what is it about peacemaking that they don't like or that they struggle with? And oftentimes there's this passive milk toast irrelevance to peacemaking in their mind, or a weakness to peacemaking in their mind. But when I kind of walk them through and say like, actually peacemakers, we are the ones who are standing up and who are having to lean on courage, and who are we're not passive at all. We are actually like standing in and being like these massive disruptors, but we're being disruptors because we love. So
spot on. I mean, one of the things that we say is that everyday peacemakers stand in front of any and every bulldozer that's crushing people. Like it is a costly, courageous way of life, fueled by Jesus. Now, here's what I love, and we're gonna stay high level, and then friends, we will sink deeper in a minute. Trust me. I hear you talking about your commitments to peacemaking, specifically with an emphasis on nonviolence. And disruption. And I know that I might be a little glitchy with my Wi-Fi has COVID. But what I want you to take those two concepts and help us understand your unique calling as a peacemaker between the Black community and the white community, with a special emphasis on aspiring white peacemakers. You do this with nonviolence and with disruption. I think I see you marry these things together. So talk to us about your unique calling and how this plays out. The work of peacemaking is your calling and how that plays out.
Yeah. So about a year and a half ago, I went to a gala where they were trying to raise money for this nonprofit that our friends were affiliated with, and I saw so much good that night, and from the white leadership, because it's a white led nonprofit, and they cared about justice, and they cared about elevating the voice of leadership there, in the different, because they were working overseas, so they cared about elevating the leadership and equipping local leaders. Like, they were doing so many good things around justice. But then they appropriated an African American spiritual in a way that just really grieved my heart, and there was really just no way that there's no they really didn't talk about like the origin of this song or the meaning of it to the Black community. And I was looking around the room at other attenders of color, Black attenders to this gala, and I was just really I just really felt like there are so many people who are passionate about justice, who are passionate about dismantling broken systems, who are learning and listening and doing the work, but then they have blind spots. And they don't realize that even though they've made these great leaps around peacemaking in some areas, there's still a lot to go. And so I kind of and this was like on a whim, I just wrote an Instagram post and I just titled it "Dear White Peacemakers." And for me, it was like I wanted to acknowledge that there are white people who are doing this work and who sometimes need to be called in more when they've been so used to being called out around this, around these areas. And that for me, if I'm going to work towards God's dream of the world as it should be, if I'm going to work towards shalom, which is this picture of harmony and wholeness and vibrancy, it's going to have to include white people, and I'm going to have to care about their wholeness and their peace and their shalom. And so I wrote this post, and people responded to it. And then I just started having more conversations with people, white people who are doing this work. And I just started saying, like, you're a peacemaker. Like, when you do this anti-racism work, it's not just you becoming quote unquote woke, which I know is like a hard word right now. There's a lot of baggage around that word. And it's not about you learning all the right things or taking all the right classes or following all the right people. Like, what you're actually doing, like when we talk about this work of anti-racism, this is peacemaking work. And I believe that this is the peacemaking work of our moment right now, of this generation, this binding up this ancient wound that is caused by white supremacy. We are at the forefront of it. And I cannot imagine a world where all is made right if the power dynamic has been shifted in such a way that white people accept shame or dehumanization, or they're not dignified and loved and respected in this work. I'm not interested in the conversation of flipping that power dynamic, because I'm not going to cause trauma out of my own trauma. When we have an instinct to harm, we seek to heal, right? And so for me, my anti-racism work is rooted in what does healing and wholeness look like for all of us? And so that means when I am working with white people, I acknowledge that this is hard work and that there are a lot of valid questions you may have. I may disagree with the premise of your question. They may even offend me. But I know that if we're having this conversation, that means you're curious, and I will honor and respect that curiosity. And also, I feel like it's so important for white people to have spiritual practices, to have spaces where they can process those hard feelings, to be able to say, like, I'm crying. This makes me sad. And to not be afraid of their tears, because those tears are viewed as a weapon. I make space for those tears. Because like I said, I'm not interested in that shift of that power dynamic. I'm interested in a world that looks like, as Dr. King cast this vision before us, it looks like the beloved community. My anti-racism work is deeply rooted in belovedness. I am beloved, you are beloved, we are beloved. I am owning my belovedness. I need you to own your belovedness. We proclaim each other's belovedness and we become the beloved community so that we can dismantle these systems of oppression and violence
Hmm.
together.
Yeah. And so talk to us about how this post to a book that launches in 5 days, May 8th, Dear White Peacemakers. Tell us about the journey, a little bit about the book, and then we're going to dive in.
Yeah, so Dear White Peacemakers was it started out as it's so interesting. Dear White Peacemaker started out as a collection of letters about like, here are the things you need to know, white people, when you're doing this work. But then George Floyd was murdered, and I sat with a lot of white people who were exhausted because they had been doing this work for a long time, and they were going to all the rallies and they were posting all the time and having all these conversations with people, their white brothers and sisters, their relatives or coworkers or friends who are like not into it. So they were, putting themselves in these hard, exhausting conversations. I also sat with a lot of white people who were like, I don't get it. And I don't think that there's any place for me to say, like, I don't get it, but like I don't get it. or and everything in between. And I just realized that the book, we didn't need another like a professorial, like we didn't need another book of like, here's all the terms you need to know. Like I say this all the time, you will always have calls to action, white peacemakers. Like around this work, you will always have calls to action. You can go to Instagram right now, find a dozen calls to action, because unfortunately white supremacy is so pervasive. It's in so many parts of our culture. It's expressed in so many different ways in our world. It's harming so many Black and brown people. So I'm not worried about you knowing what to do. I am worried about you knowing how to engage that as a whole person, as a beloved person. I'm concerned about you building systems and building practices and rhythms that will allow you to do this work for the long haul. And I care more about you having a hopeful view and knowing what you're working towards, not just what you're working against. So the book shifted away from that to really me sharing how I decided to or came to the place to embrace this work as a peacemaker. Kind of, I start the story talking about, I start the book talking about a coach who called my son the N word, and me choosing to invite him into a conversation about race and not attack him, and how hard that was for me, and the dynamics I had to deal with other Black parents in the school and the school itself. But that was a choice that I had to make out of integrity. If I look at the Jesus way and I want that to reflect the way that I do anti-racism, I had to do it that way. And then I just kind of go into my ethos and anti-racism peacemaking. And then the rest of the book is really centered around the Sermon on the Mount, kind of unpacking some of the teachings of Jesus as guideposts for our anti-racism work. And I use the Negro spirituals as sort of like a narrative thread to help us kind of understand a different aspect of anti-racism, and just really see how the Black community has been calling and inviting us into this picture of shalom from the very beginning, and that there's some richness there for white peacemakers.
And friends, I've read it, I've endorsed it. It's a book that needs to be in the library of every peacemaker. So get it. It launches in 5 days. Congratulations on that, Osheta.
Thank you.
All right, let's get into the nitty gritty here. Talk to us a little bit. How are you experiencing the fragility of relationships right now in your everyday life? And what's some of the work that you're doing to tend to the interrupted stuff with existing friendships and bridge new difference into new relationships? What are you doing?
I'm doing a lot of listening, and I'm doing a lot of I'm asking a lot of questions. There are a couple of people in my life who are really frustrated that I have been very outspoken about anti-racism in the past couple of years, and who are precious to me. And so one of the things that I have chosen to do is to learn to listen to them. So to learn to ask good questions, and to listen, and to kind of have a long, like I keep using this phrase, but long haul view of this work. I think we are so conditioned, and I talk about this in Dear White Peacemakers, as I talk about different aspects of white supremacy culture. And white supremacy culture is so rooted in an instant fix and so rooted in like quantitative results. And I think with this work, because this work is relational, it has to be organic, and we have to say that the goal is not a win. Like I get you to agree with me.
Mhm.
The goal is that we end the conversation ready and eager and open to having more conversations. That it's just like we left the door open because we trust each other. We've been loving and respectful. And while we may not ever 100% agree, we agree on each other's belovedness, and we agree on each other's inherent worth and dignity. Um, I've also learned to set really good boundaries. So part of the fragility that I have noticed in some of my relationships is this is defensiveness. You know, a lot of defensiveness. So I can ask a lot of questions, and I can have space for conversations, but that doesn't mean I don't share my own perspective, and that doesn't mean I don't answer some of those questions that I ask too, because I want people to know my heart. And I've noticed a lot of defensiveness, and so part of my work of peacemaking for myself is setting healthy boundaries. And so I don't, you know, I think one of the things that people are concerned about when they think of peacemaking as this long haul, like commitment to be continuing to be in a relationship, is that we're going to open. And I think this is what people often think about peacemakers, is that we're just doormats and we just let people walk all over us. But for me, peacemaking is honoring the imago Dei in myself and seeking peace in myself. And so I do set boundaries. So oftentimes, boundaries in relationships where I know that that person is defensive will look like, okay, so for instance, if it's online, so I have a whole different set of relational rules
Mm.
for peacemaking with online relationships. But if it's online and somebody posts something, I don't argue in comment threads. If you look at anything I post, if somebody says something negative, I usually don't engage there, because I've probably DM'd that person and say like, hey, here's my Google phone number. If you want to have a conversation, or if it's somebody that I have no idea who they are, and I suspect that they're just somebody that's out to troll because they're bored and they're getting their sense of identity and worth from their online interactions. I'll engage with them in DMs, but I give myself 3 back and forths. And then when they've like been defensive 3 times, I'm like, well, thanks so much, and I'm praying for you. But if it's somebody that I know, or that knows somebody that I know that's a part of my congregation, or in some way, shape, or form, I'll give them my Google number, because I feel like one of the ways that I combat the dehumanization of conflict right now is try to humanize people as much as possible.
Mhm.
So while it may take more time for me to do like a 30-minute phone call, I take that time because it's important for me to remember that I am dealing with a fellow image bearer who has questions and who has stories, and who's on a journey, and I get to walk alongside them at this point of their journey, in some capacity to help them kind of understand the Jesus way a little bit more. So, that's kind of what I'm seeing. And also, like, I'm a huge fan of therapy. I'm a huge fan of mediators. I'm a big fan of not triangulating conflict. So I feel like some of the relationships that I have said, you know what, let's actually bring somebody else in. Or one relationship, I'm in therapy with that person to process some things. So I think that's a valid way of us continuing to be peacemakers, is knowing our limitations, emotionally, physically, spiritually, and allowing somebody else in
Mhm.
too.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, I mean, your practices are very tangible, and it sounds like you're tenacious about this. And I love what you said earlier as well, that peacemaking is a relational endeavor. You can't legislate it. You can't force someone to it's like it's
yeah,
relationship. It's relational.
yeah,
I think you did a really good job, even in your expressions there around talking about how you like with your boundaries uh, but you live with this sense of invitation. You give people your people who you may I don't know how well you know these folk. Maybe you can explain that a little bit more. But like holding the tension between conviction and invitation Many of us think that what we actually have to do, what peace looks like, is that everybody just kind of compromises, or I just metabolize, let water flow under the bridge, and over time, I guess we'll be okay again. Turns out
Yeah.
that's not peace. We're still
No, it's not.
fractured, and it will leak out. So how do you hold that tension?
Yeah, so I make it clear. So for instance, we're talking about anti-racism. I make it clear that I'm not interested in any in any arguments pro white supremacy, because I'm not interested in reinforcing systems that prevent me from experiencing shalom, and living at peace with myself, or people that look like me. And we have seen that white supremacy is a violent culture and violent system that begets violence. So I'm not interested in that. So, and that usually that usually is a boundary that some people are not, like, when I explain what white supremacy is and how, if we're going to have this conversation, I want you to know that I'm not going to be for Confederate statues. That's just not something that I'm going to ever be convinced to. I can hear more about your story, about how your Southern heritage matters to you, and I, as a Southerner, can engage with you and explore different ways of honoring our Southern heritage that's not rooted in violence and death and theft and oppression. We can have that conversation. But so I usually set up some boundaries to begin with, and I'm pretty clear with people where I'm coming from. I think that helps. That helps kind of set the boundaries, so that so the tension I'm living in is that tension of harm and heal, and not passivity, or being a doormat, or being a jerk and flipping that power dynamic, which I know somebody mentioned in the questions, and we can circle back to that, because I'm not interested in being a moral authority and saying, like, I'm better than you because I'm a person of color and you're a white person, so you have to agree with me. But I will say, like, I'm not better than you, but I am made in God's image, and so I'm not going to have a conversation about something that refutes what I see in scripture or what the Spirit has made clear to me in my walk with Him. And so usually that happens, and so that kind of helps with that tension. I also am very, I'm very into, I try to be very thoughtful about acknowledging my vulnerability, and acknowledging when I can't take a conversation further. So for instance, if I am engaging with somebody and they keep pushing and they keep pushing, they're defensive, they're not interested in, they're just interested in arguing. I have no problem with practicing peace by saying, you know what, this conversation isn't really fruitful for either one of us anymore, and you're actually saying things that are really hurtful for me, and I want to continue having a good view of you. I want to continue living at peace with you. I think we need to table this. I think we maybe shouldn't talk about this. Maybe we should both read something and come back and talk about those concepts in that, because it's clear that we're talking past each other. We're not speaking to each other. I make it awkward for the sake of peace, because I know that's an awkward way but I feel like that's important. I think too often I have counseled so many white peacemakers who push and push and push and push, and they feel exhausted, they feel defeated, they've exhausted the person they're in a conversation with. Those people feel defeated, or they dig their heels in even more, and now it's even harder to just even get them to say, like, Black Lives Matter, because they do matter to God, and so I feel like it's really important for us to be peacemakers who model the humble way that Jesus modeled peacemaking, and being like, I am human, I am vulnerable, and I know, and us saying, like, you can't continue hurting me in these conversations, and maybe I'm not. And the other thing too is, I feel like, because we have oftentimes white supremacy culture causes us to have a higher view of ourselves, or a larger view of our overestimation of our capacity. We think that it's all up to us. Like we're going to be the only person in the entire world who's ever going to have, like, a say or an opportunity to engage with that person. And I think that we need to have a view of ourselves as we are a community of peacemakers. And I'm just planting the seed or I'm watering it. I'm just a part of this moment of peacemaking, this conversation with this person at this time. And possibly they'll see something, they'll hear something, they'll read something, it'll reinforce something I said. The spirit, like, we have to trust the work of the spirit. The spirit can do work in that person's life. I'm just showing up and being a faithful peacemaker. And I think if we can kind of just take a deep breath and just recognize that we are one of many. And that's why I make the beloved community my North Star in anti-racism work, because this is a community effort. Because God is a relational God. And so this work is relational work. Um, when we can do that, then I feel like I can be able to say those kind of things like, you know what, this isn't working. And I don't think that we should continue having this conversation in this way.
I of being okay with making it awkward. Like, we can either continue to push and hurt each other, or one of us has to be the one to say we need to take a break. I think
Yeah.
that's a really helpful practice. I want to get to the Q&As here, but one more question before I do. How do you, not in a performative way, but in a legitimate, authentic way, how do you and demonstrate teachability yourself? Like, how do you in interpersonal conflict? What are some of the things that you do with your body? What are the words that you use that demonstrates that you two are being what the goal that's being offered, at least?
Yeah. So I mean, the very first thing, like I said, is I try to make it as humanizing an engagement as possible. So if somebody corrects, so if somebody that I trust corrects me about something that I've said or written or done, like in a text or an email or something like that, I try to make it as humanizing as possible by getting on the phone with that person, by having a Zoom meeting, and because that's important for me to remember that this is relational work, and I need to view them as another person, and I need to bring my full self to it. I ask questions like, help me understand. So a phrase that I use often is, help me understand what you mean when you say this, or help me understand this idea, or can you tell me more about, so that kind of open-ended question, when somebody corrects me. I often, and this might be, I have to acknowledge that I'm a Black woman doing this work. And so I have some, trauma responses that I have just learned over my life that I have to ask myself, is that a trauma response or is that a peacemaking response? But sometimes if I feel comfortable, I will apologize, and I'll say, I'm sorry that I said this. Help me understand why that was offensive. So for instance, when I was writing Dear White Peacemakers, it was really important for me to do a land acknowledgement. And the first draft of Dear White Peacemakers, I had a land acknowledgement and I had a Dakota prayer. And after like talking to several different Dakota theologians, they were all really like, this is okay, this is fine. But then somebody else read it and they had a lot of pause, and it was actually offensive to them. And they were not Dakota, but they were Native. And I was, and my writer teacher hat, I could have been like, listen, I've talked to these notable Dakota theologians, like this is their prayer, and they said it's okay. Why are you now saying something to me like this? You're not even Dakota. But that's like such a, I mean, that is such an ignorant position for me to have. And the reason I share this is because I want white people to know that even as a person of color, I have these blind spots. So I just sit with her and say, help me understand, why is this a problem? I really want to do better. And so I ended up after some conversation, I ended up leaving it in just because I felt like it was helpful. But if you read Dear White Peacemakers now, it's not in there because after some other conversations with other people, I just realized, I just don't, it's not helpful for some of these people. This person gave me a red flag on it. I don't need it in there. I don't need it in there. And it was my commitment to relational wholeness, that I took it out. But I did have to like kind of process it all. And to this day, there are people who read the book that in that first format that it had that prayer in. They were like, that prayer was so beautiful. I don't know why you took it out. And there's one friend, I call her my book wife, because she has walked with me through the whole book writing process. She was like, do not take that prayer out. You leave that prayer in. You worked so hard and you like, and I was like, I'm just going to take it out for the sake of peace. And so that's, being willing to take the step back. Greg Boyd calls this power under, to come under, choose the humble posture and say, I don't have to be right, but I do have to be in right relationship with you. And I will make those sacrifices.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. Thank you. I want to turn to Q&A. Melanie asks, at what point do we just need to take the dust off our feet and move on? How would you interact with that?
I think a couple things. That is a personal question that I would maybe process with like a faith leader or somebody who knows me. Like my husband, I'm a 2 on the Enneagram. My husband's an 8 on the Enneagram. He is really, really good at helping me know my threshold, and what I can and can't do and what I can and can't take on. And relationships that are becoming toxic or that have capacity, like space to become life-giving, or even a good practice of me being in that relationship as a peacemaker. Like it's good for me and my growth as a peacemaker. So I think that it's good to have people that you can talk about some of these relationships with that don't know that person. They're not affected by what's going on in your interaction with them, and who love you and who will say, you know what, I think it's getting to an unhealthy place. Because I think oftentimes when peacemaking gets really hard for us, we're in a culture that just says like, bounce, like that's self-care, girl, like you don't need them. Like, so to be really careful about viewing shake the dust off your feet as a punishment, and leaning into it that way. I actually think that shake the dust off your feet is more of a protection of, you've done all that you can, and so now it's time for you to move on. Trust that the work you did was spirit inspired. Trust the spirit to do some work. And then somebody else who has some more energy, has more contacts, more experience, can come in and maybe pick up from where you left off. Again, it's that piece of, we're not the only ones who can speak truth into others' lives. And I also think that it's really good, like I said before, to say, if they say something offensive, hey, that made me really sad. I feel like we can't continue having this conversation until I work through some of the emotions of what you just said. So let's table this. So.
Give me an example in your life where you've had to table it. Can you get really practical with us in terms of how you indicate to that person that the door is always open, that there's always a spot at the table when they're ready to come back to the table? How do you do that?
Yeah, so I had I've been teaching in different capacities for anti-racism, and I spoke at a church, and a couple days later I got an email from somebody who did not agree with me. I did the back and forth 3 times, and then I gave them my Google number, and they just seemed to just reiterate the same sort of things. Like the conversation was not moving forward. They just felt like they had their talking, their lines, and they just wanted to keep saying them over and over again. And so I basically ended the conversation by saying, well, I think we've talked enough about this. I my heart around this. I thank you for sharing more. I understand your heart. I mean, for me, even if I disagree with somebody, I recognize them showing up, even in that defensive space, is them giving me time. Not giving me time, but them, committing time to this conversation. And so I just say like, hey, I acknowledge, like you committed some time to this conversation. You are obviously a very passionate person. But I don't think we can continue this conversation, but you have my phone number, or you have my email, maybe after you've read a few things, or if you have some more questions, you can send them to me, and in a few weeks we can circle back if you want. Sometimes I have like certain resources that I send people when they have the same sort of questions, because I get the same sort of questions. I'll send them that resource and say like, hey, based on our conversation, it seems like you have questions around this idea. Why don't you read this if you have any questions about it? Let's talk about this. I have found that having a resource to talk about, having something to circle back to, can de-escalate the conflict, because then it's not just your ideas and what you're passionate about, and you're not personalizing it. You're saying, well, this is what we learned around this. Let's talk about this. I want to hear more of your thoughts around it. So I'm a real big resource person, but I'm a teaching pastor, so I guess that's par for the course.
Yeah. Hey, would you pull up the Q&A on your screen, Osheta? There are two questions
Sure.
I would love for you to take a look at. One by Jen, Adriana at the bottom, and I just wonder how you read those questions and how you would interact with them.
Okay. So you said Jen, and then who was the other person?
Adriana.
Adriana. Okay.
Adriana's second one at the very bottom.
Okay, I see it. Okay. So the first question is, would you define white supremacy as primarily performative as opposed to peacemaking, which is primarily relational? Yes. Full stop. And how do you disrupt performative defensiveness in conversations? Well, I reckon for me, and I talk about this in Dear White Peacemakers, I view defensiveness as a trauma response rooted in fear. And scripture says perfect love casts out fear. So this response may not be really like popular, Jer, but when somebody is defensive with me, I try to ask questions to help me understand their fear. So I can say like, wow, I can see that the idea of taking down a statue makes you feel really uncomfortable because that's all you've ever known is that statue has been there. And just acknowledging that, like saying like, I see that fear. Can you can you help me understand why that statue is more like so important to you when you've heard people who look like me say that statue reminds them of lynching and makes them feel unsafe in their city? Why is it important to you in light of this information? So I think the first thing that I try to do to disarm defensiveness is to acknowledge that they're defending something. I think oftentimes we attack people for defending something, but if they're defending it, it matters to them. And so saying like, I see that matters to you. I think that I think that it's not helpful for it to have such a high place in your mind or in your thinking around this. But I see that it matters to you. And I think oftentimes when I say that, it kind of takes the steam out because they're prepared for me to be like, you're wrong, you're the worst, you're a racist or whatever, which I don't call white people racist, which is a whole other thing. But when I say like, I see that you're protecting something that's really important to you, this is really important to me. So how can we have a conversation around that? I think that opens up a space for relational healing that I don't think is often offered in that space. Also, and I'm going to say this as a Black person doing this work, there are certain boundaries and conversations that I don't engage with because it's just not healthy for me. So I'm really invested in helping white people know how to do that kind of work because sometimes I can't. Because like I said, I'm not going to agree with something that reinforces white supremacy, which reinforces the stripping of my imago Dei. So I'm really like part of my ministry, a part of the work I want to do is equipping white people to be able to do this kind of disarming work with white people because you don't have the same emotional visceral reaction to these conversations that I do because my very life is on the line around some of these topics and it's not so much for you. So helping white people understand how to do this is really important to me. So Jen, I hope that answered your question. Okay. Adriana, I hope I'm saying it right. Please correct me. So Osheta, can you talk about the intersection of your faith-based work with secular anti-racism efforts that have common moral ethical foundations? How do you engage with any such efforts, if at all, for example, supporting public figures, etc.? So this is an interesting question because I'm actually a part of a team right now trying to figure out how to engage with politics from a peacemaking third way perspective. So when I engage with this work, I primarily am dealing with Christians or people who at least are interested in Jesus. Maybe they wouldn't identify as Christians, but they're interested in the teachings of Jesus. So I lean pretty heavy on the teachings or the way of Jesus for when I'm teaching anti-racism. But so the intersection of your faith-based work with secular anti, well, I mean, I think that, oh, here's one thing that's important for me. I feel like oftentimes when Christians get sometimes when American Christians get excited about an idea, we kind of want to change the language around it if the language makes us uncomfortable. So for me as a Christian, I honor the work of secular sociologists, philosophers, historians, educators. I honor the work. And so if they say this is the tried and true definition of race, I'm going to say that this is what race is. I'm not going to come up and like try to create another word or another phrase, or this is what white fragility is. I will say, okay, this you've worked hard on this. As a Christian, I'm going to be humble enough to come under and say, okay, so this is what white fragility is. But as a Christian, with my framework, I see fragility as defensiveness. I see defensiveness as fear. Oh, there's something in scripture that helps me understand fear. So that's what I'm going to do. The reason this is super, super important is a lot of these people are people of color who have spent a lot of time forming these ideas. And when we as American Christians come in, and when white American Christians come in and they try to change the language by saying the blessing of whiteness, it is a deep offense to the work that they have done. And part of dismantling white supremacy is white people learning to come underneath the leadership and the thoughts and the work of people of color. And so my intersection of that is that humbling, I'm going to come underneath and learn. So I hope that answers your question.
that is the fodder of a next webinar or a next big conversation. Wow. Thank you for those questions, friends. You're going to receive an email follow-up with many of the links that have been mentioned in this conversation, as well as a recording for this conversation. We encourage you to use it far and wide within your spheres of influence. I also want to draw your attention to Osheta's upcoming book, Dear White Peacemakers, launches in 5 days. Please pre-order this book and help us and her spread the word on this. The second resource is in our link tree. You have the opportunity to register for the live debrief session where we're going to continue to process these ideas in some more detail so that we can transition learning to living. That's what this is about. So don't just consume the inspiration. Let's learn how to become substantively different kinds of people as a result of it. And so you'll get those links. I want to say a special word of thanks to our Embers community, which is our community of monthly investors who make resources like these accessible for as many people as possible. And so if you're a funder of the Global Immersion Project and our mission, thank you for making this conversation as accessible as you have. Osheta, thank you with us and for opening up your life in this way. I want you to have the last word. And so how would you bless and encourage this community of aspiring peacemakers?
I would bless you to stay curious. That's not a new phrase, but curiosity really is a reflection of humility. And I think that is so needed for white peacemakers right now. I think that's so needed for people of color who are looking in, seeing white people access humility, and not a humility that's rooted in shame. So I guess my final word is that I am beloved and you are beloved and we are beloved. And so let's go out and build and become the beloved community.
Amen and amen. Ciao for now, folks. Thanks, Osheta.
Welcome. Bye.